Well, hello everyone. This is the live streaming channel of the Blackheath Philosophy Forum, which is a community group based in the Upper Blue Mountains, New South Wales, Australia, that for some years has been arranging public discussion forums on philosophical topics. Because of the virus, we've moved our events from our usual windy municipal hall to the web. And my name is Peter Baldwin. And I chair the forum. I thought we could take advantage of a 3-week gap in our originally scheduled program to have a discussion about the general theme we chose for this year's series of talks, which is a new dark age, emerging threats to free speech and the liberal order. I'll be joined in this discussion by John Stevenson, a local author and stalwart of the Blackheath Philosophy Forum, indeed a former chairman. Here's the plan for today. I'll speak for roughly 25 minutes. John will then respond, raising whatever issues he sees fits, which we will discuss for a further period. You can give us your thoughts by posting in the chat window as this is going on. We'll then take a short break to make a cup of tea or a whiskey on the rocks or whatever suits your fancy, then resume to respond to the chat entries. As I've been promising for some time, there'll be a facility on our website to continue discussions in detail. Expect an email about that next week. Sign up to our email list if you're not already on it at blackheathphilosophy.org if you want to be kept notified of that. So here's my opening spiel. You might be wondering what we are getting at here. A new dark age. That is surely exaggerated, hyperbolic. Perhaps absurdly so, you might think. I should stress at the outset that I'm not actually a prophet of doom. The bad scenarios that I worry about are probably avoidable, but we need to be able to have honest discussions about them and take timely action. A number of centres have recently been set up around the world to study what is termed existential risks to humanity. And in fact, one of our earlier speakers, Professor Hugh Price, of Cambridge University, actually heads one up. And I'll just show you, where is he? Yeah, this is his centre at Cambridge University, Centre for Existential Risk. Existential threats include things like lethal pandemics, maybe much worse than the present one, global wars, out of control nanotechnologies, meteor strikes. I won't try to list them all. According to the British astronomer Royal Sir Martin Rees, the most discussed one, climate change, could be the least of our worries. Now that's a cheerful thought. But the one I'll focus on today concerns the possible loss of the rights and freedoms, especially freedom of speech, that people living in post-Enlightenment Western societies like ours tend to take for granted. We've become dangerously complacent about, and in some circles are actually starting to despise. I think we're like the proverbial boiling frog, not noticing how these freedoms are being steadily eroded at a historical juncture when powerful international forces with very different value systems are encroaching. At this point, I'll make a short digression to talk about the original Dark Age, but more specifically about an odd shift in the scholarly consensus about its nature. The term Dark Age or Dark Ages were widely used until fairly frequently to refer to the centuries following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, often taken to coincide with the toppling of the last Western emperor in the year 476 CE. The Dark Ages were contrasted with the Classical Age in European history, Greece with its philosophical and architectural with its philosophical and proto-scientific legacy, Rome with its remarkable engineering and architectural achievements, as well as its legal system and cultural achievements, not least the Latin alphabet we use today. These were complex and sophisticated societies in anyone's terms. According to the old conventional wisdom, all this was overturned when Rome was overwhelmed by invading barbaric tribes, the Goths, the Vandals, the Sueves, and several others. All those achievements were cast down as societies reverted to a primitive state. To sum up, the civilization of the Western classical world was destroyed, and it took out the best part of half a millennium for European civilization to start to recover. But was it? Nowadays, the very term civilization raises hackles in academic circles, let alone any talk of contrasting a civilized state of society with a primitive, barbarous condition indicated by a term like Dark Ages. If you Google Dark Ages, a bunch of items pop up with titles like "The Dark Ages weren't as dark as we thought." You could say that talk of Dark Ages has become pretty much verboten in respectable academia. It reeks of odious cultural comparisons, even shock horror, making value judgments about what happened. Some of the scholarly literature actually denies the Western Roman Empire ever fell at all, but rather underwent a kind of transformation, as the invaders in effect took it over, making some changes along the way that we should not think of as retrograde. Even the barbarian invasions themselves are downgraded to essentially a migratory phenomenon. None of this seems particularly surprising given the climate in postmodern academia. No doubt the old viewpoint would be denounced as racist were it not for the inconvenient fact that those seen as barbarous were overwhelmingly of Germanic origin, quintessential white people, toppling a civilization of people of darker Mediterranean skin tones. I recently read what seems like a decisive demolition of the new orthodoxy by the Oxford historian and archaeologist Brian Ward Perkins. And this is the book I'm referring to. I'll just get it up. Just show it on the screen. Where are we? Oops. There. Okay, the fall of Rome and the end of civilization. So, anyway, here's what he says in his book. The new orthodoxy is that the Roman world in both East and West was slowly and essentially painlessly transformed into a medieval form. However, there's an insuperable problem with this new view. It does not fit the mass of archaeological evidence now available, which shows a startling decline in Western standards of living during the 5th to 7th centuries, which was no mere transformation, but a decline on a scale that can reasonably be described as the end of civilization. So the Dark Ages really were dark. Life sucked for the overwhelming majority of people. Ward Perkins maintains there is a lesson for us in this. Here is the concluding paragraph of his book. There's a real danger for the present day in a vision of the past that explicitly sets out to eliminate all crisis and all decline. The end of the Roman West witnessed horrors and dislocation of a kind I sincerely hope never to have to live through, and it destroyed a complex civilization, throwing the inhabitants of the West back to a standard of living typical of prehistoric times. Romans before the fall were as certain as we are today that their world would continue forever, substantially unchanged. They were wrong. We would be wise not to repeat their complacency. To which I say, as a former politician, hear, hear. I'll now elaborate, starting with what I think is a statement of the obvious. We are living in an era when the civilizational tectonic plates are shifting. What might this imply for the future of societies like ours? Back in the early 1990s, in the wake of the ending of the Cold War, two rival prognoses for the future of the world were put forward. On the one hand, Francis Fukuyama famously asserted that we were seeing the end of history, by which he meant that social and cultural evolution of humanity had pretty much ended with the triumph of liberal democracy and market economics. There was, in his view, no viable alternative way to organise a modern society. In opposition to this, Samuel Huntington, another American political theorist, posited a clash of civilization. civilizations. In his view, the main conflicts in the 21st century would be along cultural and civilizational lines, in contrast to the wars of ideology that featured large in the 20th century. We can now, I think, see that Fukuyama's vision has been shown wrong and Huntington vindicated. The most significant development has been that the Communist Party regime in mainland China, having carefully studied the collapse of the Soviet bloc, has managed to develop a governance model that combines a limited form of market economics, depending heavily on participation in global markets, with an autocratic Leninist state structure. The view, widely held in leading circles in the West, that incorporating China into global markets and institutions like the WTO would inevitably lead to political liberalisation, has not been vindicated, to put it mildly, as autocratic rule has not just been sustained in China, but seems to be evolving to a kind of technologically based totalitarianism using the most advanced surveillance techniques coupled with artificial intelligence to process the data. To stress what should be obvious, my comments reflect no animus against Chinese people and Chinese culture. They are solely aimed at the repressive regime that now controls that country. I often think of the other China on the island of Taiwan that has achieved broadly based prosperity and a well-ordered society with free speech and democratic governance. How appalling that governments, corporations and institutions all over the world have been bullied into treating it as a pariah. The other major emergent force that should concern us is the arrival of militant political Islam operating on a global scale and increasingly assertive in the Western world, especially those countries in Western Europe with large populations from the Middle East, North Africa and South Asia. According to the historian Niall Ferguson, this has produced a civilizational divide within these countries, running right through the middle of their major urban centres. Why should this bother us? Again, I hold no animus against Muslims as people, but I do think it is important to consider certain features of the Islamic creed that make very problematical its relationship to liberal societies. The key problem is that Islam does not envisage, indeed is incapable of envisaging, a clear separation between civil and religious realms. There's a lot to be said about this, but consider the question of human rights. In 1948, the UN adopted the UN Declaration of Human Rights, which, among other things, asserts rights to freedom of thought, opinion, and religion. Back then, most Islamic states, with the important exception of Saudi Arabia, signed on. However, with the global revival of militant political Islam, the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation, which represents the 57 Muslim majority states, decided to adopt a rival declaration, the Cairo Declaration of Human Rights in Islam, which stipulates clearly that all rights are subject to Sharia. For example, it says, everyone shall have the right to express his opinion freely in such manner as would not be contrary to the principles of Sharia. Everyone shall have the right to advocate what is right and propagate what is good and warn against what is wrong and evil according to the norms of Islamic Sharia. These two conceptions of human rights are like chalk and cheese and are already producing serious tensions in some Western countries, such as the controversy about the scores of Sharia courts now operating in the UK. A key difference between what we face today and the Cold War is that in the Cold War, the rival blocs were largely, not totally, but largely hermetically separated. Nowadays, as a result of global economic integration and massive population movements, these rival cultures and value systems face each other cheek by jowl. They have been woven into the interstices of all liberal democratic societies and are able to exploit to the full the vulnerabilities that attend the political freedoms that exist in such societies. Our ability to respond to these major external challenges is severely compromised by the baleful influence of the identity politics ideology that is all pervasive in Western academia and its diffusion to all tiers of the education system, the media, the political class and business elites, Most importantly, the giant social media corporations that now act as the gatekeepers to the digital public square. I posted a series of polemical articles denouncing this ideology on the forum website last year. The articles contend that there is nothing progressive about it, and that in key respects it is the opposite of what it claims to be. Rather than being anti-racist, it is inherently racist and acts to perpetuate racial divisions. Rather than being helpful to disadvantaged groups, when translated into political action, it positively harms them. And it is deeply reactionary, effectively repudiating the Enlightenment inheritance that I always regarded as being constitutive of any worthwhile leftist politics. The last of these articles, which I posted a year ago, goes further and argues that identity politics threatens civilization as we know it. The article is by far the longest in the set, running to over 25,000 words. I'll try to encapsulate the essential argument. It starts with that word civilization that postmodern academia seems to have such a problem with. I mentioned at the start that it is nowadays unfashionable to suggest there was a dark age that marked the end of a distinctive civilization and its replacement by something fundamentally different. The same mentality was echoed in the recent debate over the Ramsay proposal to establish some small programs devoted to the study of Western civilization in Australian universities. Such programs, it was said, would inevitably be Eurocentric, racist, and even white supremacist, devoted to the glories of the West and ignoring the crimes of colonialism, slavery, and so on. This despite the Ramsay CEO, Simon Haynes, making clear that such studies would take a warts and all approach. Some, like the international academic celebrity, Kwame Anthony Appiah, take matters further and deny that there is any such thing as a distinctive Western civilization at all. In an article in The Guardian, which I'll just display, actually, there is no such thing as Western civilization. Get rid of that. Trying to control the show as I go. Anyway, in this Guardian article, he contends that there are no civilizations as such, just different combinations of interesting and generally benign cultural traits. He lumps together music, cuisine, dress, religion, and values, and suggests that they can be mixed and matched to taste in his ideal multicultural nirvana. The absurdity of his contention is revealed in these two sentences from his article. Quote, "No Muslim essence stops the inhabitants of Dar al-Islam from taking up anything from Western civilization, including Christianity or democracy. No Western essence is there to stop a New Yorker of any ancestry taking up Islam." Now, is he serious? I mean, the second sentence is true, but what about the small matter of apostasy, that all the main schools of Islamic jurisprudence state should be punished by death, reflected in the criminal code of a dozen Islamic states? In stark contrast to the virulent hostility to Ramsay, there have been next to no complaints from students or university staff organisations about the presence of 13 Confucius centres funded by the Chinese regime in Australian universities. In the article I mentioned above, I cite clear evidence that far from being innocently focused on cultural exchange, these centres are an integral part of the Chinese Communist Party's global soft propaganda apparatus, a point explicitly acknowledged by senior Chinese regime officials. More sinister as evidence cited in a report by the National Association of Scholars in America, that these centres have a role in surveillance of Chinese students, orchestrating campaigns against dissidents, and even espionage. Clive Hamilton, who will be speaking to our forum next Saturday, wrote an article that appeared in the Australian on Wednesday last about a sustained and vicious campaign against Drew Pavlou, an undergraduate philosophy student at the University of Queensland who organised demonstrations in support of the democracy campaigners in Hong Kong. According to Hamilton, this is from his article, he then was targeted by a torrent of online hate and death threats from patriotic Chinese students. China's Consul General in Brisbane, Zhu Ji, praised the violence, drawing a rebuke from Foreign Minister Maurice Payne. Pavlou decided to seek a protection order against the Consul General through the courts. End quote. Incredibly, as Hamilton describes in the article, the administration of Queensland University actually joined in the persecution of this student, mobilising its law firm, Clayton Utz, and summoning him to a secret disciplinary hearing at which he faces possible expulsion. The sad reality is that Australian universities have become so dependent on student fees and other income from China that they feel compelled to act in this way, with minimal to no resistance from individuals and groups that you would normally expect. This is just one instance of the compromising of free speech rights in educational institutions across the Western world. How lamentable that a regime intent on creating a new, more perfect totalitarianism through what some have called algorithmic governance can force Australian universities to act as censors and tolerate outright thuggery directed at dissidents. In the long article, I also talk about the clout Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states are bringing to bear on Middle Eastern study centres around the world, especially the US and the UK, through the enormous funds they channel into these institutions. Perhaps the most sinister aspect of this is the incentive for researchers to self-censor, avoiding topics that might displease their sponsors. An article in the online magazine Vox cites a Middle East expert who states, quote, "I could write about Saudi sectarianism, but then I might lose some money," the expert said, explaining the thoughts of a Gulf-funded scholar might have. "I could write about UAE human rights abuses, but you know, there are abuses everywhere, and there are a million other things I can write about." Then we have the ANU here in Australia, which rejected Ramsay funding, but is quite happy to accept funding from Iran and other unsavoury regimes for its Middle East Study Centre. The lack of resistance to these encroachments on the integrity and independence of higher education in the Western world is both remarkable and lamentable. The French writer Pascal Bruckner describes the pathological culture that explains this behaviour in his book, The Tyranny of Guilt, an essay on Western masochism, where he sums it up this way, quote, "Indulgence towards foreign dictatorships, intransigence towards our own democracies, an eternal movement, critical thought, at first subversive, turns against itself and becomes a new conformism, but one that is sanctified by the memory of its former rebellion. Yesterday's audacity is transformed into cliches. Remorse has ceased to be connected with precise historical circumstances. It has become a dogma, a spiritual commodity, almost a form of currency," end quote. This would be bad enough if confined to universities and intellectual circles where, as research by the American social psychologist Jonathan Haidt has shown, there is something approaching an ideological monoculture. But it is not. With large proportions of young people nowadays going to university, this ideology has spread from humanities and social science faculties to all levels of the education system, government, politics, and the corporate sector. Given the situation I've just described, I believe there's no more important priority than to defend freedom of speech. Until quite recently, the importance of this key legacy of the Enlightenment was common ground across the mainstream political and ideological spectrum. This is no longer the case. In recent years, we've become accustomed to an ever-growing plethora of legal restraints on speech in the form of subjectively defined hate speech laws that, in addition to intimidation, restrict what is sayable on the basis of offence or insult. In some countries, such laws are very aggressively enforced to the point where, in the UK, for example, around 15,000 prosecutions are launched every year. In some extraordinary recent cases in the UK, people have been interrogated by police even when no offence has been committed, just to check their thinking. Some recent judicial judgments in Europe amount to the introduction of a de facto blasphemy prohibition in cases where the tenets of Islam in particular are criticised. Possibly more important than the legal restraints is the censorious climate that pervades many institutions in both the public and private sector whenever some offence against the latest iteration of the ever-changing identitarian ideology is committed. Such an offence, even if trivial, can lead to social and professional death. The external forces of totalitarianism can easily manipulate this mentality for their own purposes, as when the travel bans imposed on China to avoid spread of the coronavirus were denounced as xenophobic and racist, to be reliably echoed by a certain kind of progressive. And any attempt to raise problematical aspects of the Islamic creed are likely to be denounced as Islamophobic, viewed as a species of racism, and can lead to prosecution in some European countries. A YouGov poll in Britain showed 1/3 of respondents fearful of expressing their real views about contentious topics such as immigration and religion. This mentality has a stupefying effect on the ability to hold honest debates about some of the most important issues we face. One of the cardinal virtues of post-Enlightenment Western civilizations is its self-reflective capacity that has provided an important impetus for reform. In the age of identity politics, I fear this virtue has morphed into a morbid civilizational self-loathing. What hope for free speech with these looming external totalitarian threats and the scope for honest debate stymied? Could future historians look back on the free societies that emerged after the Enlightenment as a short historical blip? I would like to think not, but we better stop taking them for granted. Well, that's it. John, you probably have some ideas about that. Just let me... You there, John?
Yes, can you hear me? Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Well, thanks very much for all that, Peter. I'm sure everybody's been...
I think we've probably got about 20 unsubscribes in the last few minutes. Anyway.
I've said before that I'm not particularly qualified to discuss cases, without the close knowledge that you've built up of them. And I also just make a little point in regard to the Ramsey matter, which I've spoken about at the forum. From my own sprinkling of friends across academia, very fair-minded people, I learned there was unhappiness with the implication of the proposal that our current university pedagogy is inadequate, that Western civilization is not being studied in all its many aspects, but not perhaps on block, but effectively. And but I concede this whole pedagogic style is very much still at issue. So, well, you've outlined a threat which is a trident, it seems a trident of sharp points. China sounds like Trump. China, militant Islam, and within our Western democratic societies, a fifth column of our day, a myopic identity politics fissiparition, might call it, assisted by an academia gripped by hatred and guilt for its own culture and history. So I'd like to respond with two broad questions. And the first would be, what is your ultra dystopian worst case vision for how this new darkness might come upon us? Just a few thoughts if I might just,
Sure.
elaborate on the question a little bit. It's hard to see that it would include a widespread loss of technological capacities, as there appears to have been after the fall of Rome, for example. Just as an aside here, I've noticed that there's British historians still sort of scratch their heads about why the Roman roads became overgrown and in disrepair very quickly after the legions left. Didn't seem to make much sense. Couldn't the Britons see a good idea in front of them? But you'll see theories where the way Anglo-Saxon villages were organized, the way they traded with each other, that the radiation of roads, Roman style, was just not of use to them. Well, anyway, that's all very interesting and lots to talk about there. But in the matter of technological capacity, what's scary about the China case is its super capacity in this area, particularly in surveillance and social control, yet unfettered by any commitment to individual rights, of freedom and privacy, etc. And you've spoken eloquently on this. But just a point to make. I think our cultural.
Can I respond? You've said a fair bit there, John. Can I just quickly respond?
Yeah. I'm making this far. I'm doing a real forum no here of asking far too long a question.
Yeah, if I was chairing it, I'd say, ask the question.
No.
Well, on the point about a new dark age, to use that term, not involving the sort of collapse in the capacity for sophisticated manufacturing and engineering that accompanied the original dark age. Yes, I agree. But in what sense might things go dark? Well, I'm talking about the ability of people to argue and debate matters that are contentious and that, and to state views freely, which is something we've had substantially, in the post-Enlightenment period. Just to give one example, I recently read a biography of Robert G. Ingersoll, who's a well-known orator and lawyer in late 19th century America, who spent his time traveling around the country, issuing vehement polemics against established religions. And he was extremely funny. This was an age where oratory was much more of a thing than it is nowadays with electronic media. And a book by, this biography even by Susan Jacoby described how he'd go the length and breadth of the country, which was full of an awful lot of fundamentalist Christians. And without impediment. In fact, in some cases, most of the audience was made up of Christians who came along to dispute him. But there'd be a situation where they couldn't restrain themselves from laughing at his jokes because they were so funny. Imagine doing that with Islam nowadays. It'd be unthinkable. And when I talk about boiling frog, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. And you'd have similar exchanges in the old days down in the Sydney Domain, which is when I was a misspent teenage years hanging around the Sydney Domain on a Sunday afternoon, watching the Rationalist Society and the Christian fundamentalists go at each other. And but there's a sort of an implicit acceptance that sort of exchange about Islam is not on. On the technology point, I agree. Technology is not going to go dark. In fact, it's going to be potentially the implement for the imposition of darkness. And what we're seeing in China at the moment through that so-called social credit scheme is it's frankly terrifying. It's when I read Orwell's 1984, I thought to myself, all the things like televiewers and all this stuff, that all could happen in future. But I thought, well, who's going to analyse all this data? Well, there's a technological answer to that now, and that's artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence, artificially intelligent agents can do that work. So you're looking at the potentiality for a technologically based perfect totalitarianism. Now, that would be bad enough in China, but with the digitalization of all information around the world, that won't stay in China. You might have a media organization in the left saying something inconvenient, and it's happening now, subjected to a so-called distributed denial of service attack. So, yeah, I accept that point you make. When we talk about dark age, it'd be a different sort of dark age, but potentially, But just on the Ramsey thing, the Ramsey Centre to set up a program of studies of Western civilization. Well, I presume the idea of it is to allow the study of the various aspects of that: literature, philosophy, the scientific developments, etc. Look at that as a coherent whole and the linkages. And I think what people really don't like about it is that it might present that whole intellectual historical legacy in a somewhat more positive light than is normal nowadays. But it's such a minuscule thing compared to the overwhelming weight of other characterizations of Western civilization that it's hard to see what the objection is. But then, no problem with Confucius centers. I just find that astonishing.
Yeah, look, as you happen to have mentioned Orwell's 1984.
Before you go on, the reason we can't see John is, of course, he can't get his camera to display properly. So we're not censored. He's not on a witness protection program or anything like that. Go on, John.
It's just 1983 here. Look, as you mentioned 1984, as I recall in that dystopia, there's presented a very dreary proletarianizing of the population at a very basic standard of living under a super privileged elite. But it just allows me to make a bit of a point about China, another sort of point, that despite corruption and alongside this will to power and social control, they have brought such a tremendous number of their people out of poverty, and they've got a massive building program for improved accommodation. So it just tempers, we need to temper our idea of what this dark age would look like. Look, in the second case of Islam and the militant Islam and the growth of immigrant Muslim communities in our democratic Western societies, and the spread of a sort of will to Sharia law among them, I just wanted to have us think about how hypothetical that might be, how real a fear that is. We've got a lot of experience of, not so far back in our own Western countries, of militant and repressive Christianity, and we still have today sort of black letter fundamentalist Christians who think everything in the Bible has to be followed. And yet that does not work out as being the way Christianity continues to have influence generally in our country. So why couldn't we allow some optimism that eventually the broad mass of Muslim people who are ordinary human beings and who've tasted the kind of life they can have here will drift away from that until it will seem as seem as bizarre to them as, the Spanish Inquisition does to us now. So, that's the point.
Yeah. That's obviously what we have to hope for. But there's several problems. Number one, I said in the talk that the problem with Islam and its relationship to liberal democratic society is in large part creedal. There's no concept of a clear separation of church, mosque and state, like there is. Christianity specifically provides for it, for that verse in Matthew, which talks about render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's and unto God that which is God's. So there's nothing analogous to that. And that permeates everything. I talked about the different way of looking at human rights. Human rights in the Enlightenment Western tradition are seen as something universal. Whereas the Islamic Cairo Declaration of Human Rights in Islam specifically makes everything conditional upon compliance with Sharia. So free speech can be free as long as it's Sharia compliant. In other words, it's not free. So there's a difference, I think, between these religious traditions, even allowing for the existence of Christian fundamentalist fanatics.
It's a fair point, but again, I don't know. I'm just waiting to see how that will eventually work out. Well, I won't be here, but you know what I mean.
Can I make the other point I wanted to make about that was that it ought to be the case that a Muslim living in a Western society should feel free to say, well, I was born into a Muslim community, but I don't subscribe to this religion. I don't like it, and to publicly state reasons why. Now, there have been a number of cases. There's a young American woman from Pakistani Muslim background by the name of Sarah Haider, who set up a group called the Organization of Ex-Muslims of North America. And she gave a speech to the American Humanist Society where she said when she defected from Islam and started to criticize it, she expected to be attacked by Muslims at Muslim organizations. What she did not expect was to be denounced equally vehemently, and this is what she says. It's on YouTube if anybody wants to look it up. She got equally savage denunciation from her erstwhile left-wing progressive colleagues who coined phrases like Uncle Tom, house Arab, native informant, in a sense, was the most sinister one. So she was subjected to all this. And she continues to identify as a left liberal. She was appalled by the election of Donald Trump and so forth, but she's just saying that she gets no support. And a similar situation arose in the UK with the head of the analogous organisation in the UK, and who also described how, when she was trying to give a talk at the University of London, she was denounced. This is somebody who a left winger actually, a very far leftist, but who didn't subscribe to Islam anymore and wanted to talk about it. I give particulars about all this in the article, which is linked to below the video. But she went to talk when she goes to talk at universities, there are calls for no platforming. At the University of London, when she tried to speak, there were, people claimed they felt unsafe by her presence. And what was astonishing about it was that these calls for her to be no platform were actually backed by the LGBT and feminist clubs. How weird is that?
Yeah. As I say, it's it's a dystopian prospect. Look, because I think
it's a problem, because if we're in a society where, irrespective of what community you happen to be born into, you know and expect that you've got the right to make your own judgments about whatever the cultural milieu that you happen to be in, you know, whether you want to remain part of it or not. But, you know, in Islam, there's the death penalty for apostasy, which obviously doesn't get implemented in the West. But what does happen is that people, and this is, you know, ex-Muslims have testified to this, that you're subjected to enormous social ostracism, and, you know, families wiping you out and not wanting to have anything to do with you. It makes it very difficult. So this is a real problem. But what I don't like is the interplay between so-called progressive identity politics mentality, which says if you're born into this group, you should remain loyal to it and you should stick to the script. That's what I find a problem, and that's what makes it potentially difficult for, you know, Muslims, a lot of Muslims, to be sort of brought into the mainstream, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, look, I think we're going to be out of time fairly soon, so I'll just cut to the second very general question I wanted to put to you, which is, what are your thoughts for the path to cure, you know, the road out of this, the way back? How can we think positively about where to go from where we are, you know, how these issues need to be confronted? Now, you know, I think we'd all probably have noticed that most of the identity politics critique is coming from the right and the right-wing press and media, and to which the generally sort of left-leaning, you know, quote, progressive part of the population are generally immune. So how can this be made into a broad issue, in a sense, you know, a left issue as well as a right issue, as it is clearly for you personally? And just one other little thing here I'd like to say about this, talking about the media. When we talk about freedom of speech, you know, people tend to think about an individual's right to speak out in public as to what, you know, he or she believes. But there's an enormous inequality of outreach, or reach and resource in freedom of speech. I mean, you know, Rupert Murdoch has a lot more freedom of speech than either you or I do. Freedom of speech operates through a delta of organs of the media, platforms, what have you. Have you got some thoughts about how, you know, we might think about, you know, reconstructing that, or moving in a different direction with all that? So, yes, just summing up, what are your ideas on the way out of this?
Well, I think a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition, but a necessary condition of achieving a future where the freedoms that we take for granted continue to exist and are not gradually sort of attenuated, is that we need to take a stand against a mindset that says everything done by Western civilization is terrible. I mean, the rhetoric that you see on social media, but not just in social media, is quite extraordinary. One of the earlier talks I referred to an episode of the ABC's Minefield program, where you had the compere, a guy called Scott Stevens, on with two critical race academics, Alana Lenton from Western Sydney University and Joanna Cruikshank from Deakin University. And the title of the session was "Wrong to be White." And basically, it was all about what a terrible thing whiteness is. Now, they have a particular way of conceptualizing, but there's an extraordinary quote which I've showed it in the first talk we had, these video streams, where Scott Stevens asserts that being white is a grave moral sin. I mean, it's sort of quasi-religious, you know. Now, they would say, well, by whiteness, we mean, you know, people with a lot of power or something. But do they ever stop to think to themselves how people who happen to have white skin, who might not be at all privileged, might respond to this? There's an American scholar by the name of Karen Stenner, who's studied how people respond to what she calls normative threats. That is to say, things said about people that derogatory things that said about a group that people are in. And it's like a trigger for intolerant behavior on the part of the people who hear this stuff. And so it seems to me a stand needs to be taken against this ideology. And by the way, it's not just the right that is, there's a growing number of voices of people who identify as leftist in most respects, in the same I do. I'm still a traditional social democrat. I favour a society that isn't marked by steep social hierarchies and gross inequalities, and a goal of policy needs to be to remedy that to the extent possible. But I adhere to the old view about equality, that you know, when we look at somebody, we judge them, as Martin Luther King famously said, by the content of their character, not the colour of their skin or any other superficial feature. And so my view is that people need to start speaking out and campaigning against this ideology of identarian ideology, which I think is shockingly counterproductive. I mean, it's something that it's kind of a horrible mutation of what were entirely admirable movements to get to end racial discrimination, achieve gender equality, get the state off the backs of people because of their sexual orientation and so forth. All these things were very important and were great movements. But you seem to have ended up with this kind of thing where it turned morbid and in some respects turned into its opposite. So that instead of aspiring to a future where people don't think about racial distinctions much, there's an insistence we've got to perpetuate racial distinctions, where instead of saying all people have certain basic rights such as speech, etc., there's a mentality that says you've got to be viewed first and foremost as a member of a group or some intersecting group of identity categories that then define who you are and what you can say. I think it's incredibly retrograde. And now, there's no easy solution. The issue of the relationship with China and the power it exercises is not a simple matter, you know. But people at least need to say there's a problem here, and not tolerate a situation where a University of Queensland can actually act as the enforcer of the Chinese state, which is effectively what they're doing. I mean, I just find that it just horrifies me.
Yeah, look, well, I think we might have reached the time where you would want to let people have a break. And
sure, yeah, okay. Well, I think you and I need a break. So
I hope that people have been stimulated to, you know, have their own thoughts and want to make contributions now on the chat line, and we'll look forward to those.
Yeah, there's an awful lot in the chat stream, so we obviously, I'm not sure we're going to scratch the surface of it. Now, Nick, we want to be able to continue these discussions in much more detail than the chat feed allows. Next week, there'll be an email going out with links and so forth, whereby on our website you can set out your point of view about all this at whatever length you choose. There'll be no length restriction, believe it or not. And we hopefully we can get some really interesting discussion threads going. We're obviously, it's going to be hard to, we're not going to get through today everything. So at this point, I suggest we adjourn for a short while, 5 minutes or so we can refresh our wine glasses or whatever it is anything else we want to do, and resume in about 5 minutes. So I'll put up a little. Normally, when we were doing it in the hall, we'd just have a. This would be the break to have afternoon tea. Now we can't do a real afternoon tea, so we'll have a virtual one. There it is. It's pretty good, doesn't it? So I suggest it's now 4:56. Can I suggest we resume at 5 minutes past 5?
That's the best afternoon tea offering I've ever seen at the Philosophy Forum.
Yeah. It's not bad, is it? 5 minutes. Hang on, what are we doing? Let's just do it. Give me a minute. I've just got to change the time on this thing. About 5. Okay, there's the afternoon tea. So you can gaze upon it and wish you had it. And we'll resume at 5 minutes past 5. So just a short break to do whatever we want to do. Good, thank you. And thanks, John. That's great. Good. Just mute your mic while we do.
Peter?
Yep. We're back. We're back. Okay. Now, I'll start to run through the comments. Number of people saying hello, good, greeting each other. Enrico Brick says, "Here, here, Peter." Well, one supporter anyway. Barking Madeline, "I don't recognise my native country now, and don't think it can't happen here." Well, let's take that as a comment. Enrico Brick, "I'm not sure, though, that the Chinese phenomenon is a cultural one, a la Huntington, but rather a complex combination of the totalitarian ideology with Confucianism." Well, I agree. I suppose it means depends what you mean by culture in a broad sense, but the basic proposition, I think, is, the way you characterise it, I think, is right. So, John, do you want to add in anything, or
No, leave it with you.
chip in whenever you want? Andrews Hex, "Islamic theocracy, CCP autocracy, and transnational Western autocratic capitalism all reject either formally or in practice the universal human rights." I'm not sure what Andrus means by autocratic capitalism. I mean, I don't see anything inherent in, let's call it a market economy that precludes adherence to universal human rights, unless you include that some of the so-called positive rights, which some people could argue, the right to housing and education and so forth. But I tend to, my view of positive rights is that the rights characterization of, is the wrong way to approach those issues, because they all involve decisions about how to allocate scarce resources, which are inherently political. But Andrus might be able to elaborate on that when we, on the website next week, once we get that online discussion going. Okay, David Sanderson, "We're far more threatened by radical Christianity, which is especially apparent in the USA. Muslims are small minorities in Western countries and are much more threatened than they are threatening." Well, as I said in the discussion with John, I think there are some fundamentalist Christians, but the Christian theology makes provision for separate civil and religious realms, which is not the case with Islam, which makes it a fundamentally different kind of problem to deal with, in my view. So there's nothing, I think, comparable. If you look at Western Europe, where there are substantial Muslim populations, in Britain, for example, we see the emergence of a network of Sharia courts, which in theory have no legal clout, but in practice have a great deal of clout. And there's a seeming inability to, there's been a lot of concern expressed about them, and quite legitimate concern. There's nothing analogous to that arising from fundamentalist Christianity, I would think.
Could I speak?
Yeah, go ahead.
Look, I think David's got a point here. I think there are a lot of American fundamentalist Christians who don't like the separation between church and state, and would like to blur them together. And you can see the way, the Supreme Court is being taken over by those who will satisfy the religious right rather than the broader majority of Americans. I just think David does have a point here.
All right. Well, I'm not sure what decisions you're talking about. I mean, the only thing where this is very much to the fore, I suppose, is issues like abortion law and gay marriage and issues like that, where you could say the religious right comes into play. But I don't think it's really analogous in that you're not seeing the emergence of a kind of a parallel legal system. You have a political and legal system which is contestable in a normal way, rather than, the example I gave of the UK with Sharia courts, a sort of a parallel system starting to emerge. Anyway, shall we move on to the next one? Andrew says, it is ultra-right fundamentalist Christianity making a mockery of Christ. Well, I'll leave it to, I think I'd be inclined to leave it to the theologians to argue about that one. Do you got any comment, John?
No.
Barking Madeline. In what way, David, I heard the same talking points he's addressing somebody else in the stream. Right. Madeline and David will have to argue that one out. David Sanderson. Trump is in office because of the currents of Western civilization's superiority and radical Christianity. Trump and the forces of reaction and authoritarianism that he represents the real threat. Trump's an interesting phenomenon. I think in terms of ideology, he's been all over the map in the course of his life. For most of his life, he was a supporter of the Democratic Party rather than the Republican Party. And people need to ask themselves, if you complain about Trump, you need to ask what led to his election. And to a considerable extent, if you look at what happened in the 2016 election, the low-income white working class defected en masse. I think in the 2008 election, John McCain, the Republican candidate, they got 48%, and whereas Trump got 60% in the 2016 election. So there was in states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Ohio, there was a substantial shift. Now, rather than complaining about Trump, it'd be more helpful if the Democrat Party actually asked themselves why that occurred. And it, to some extent, occurred because those people, low-income whites, felt that, the whole system was stacked against them and geared towards helping just about every other group. There's an American liberal humanities professor called Mark Lilla who wrote an article for the New York Times about that, saying that the Democrat Party basically wasn't interested in that group. In fact, Hillary Clinton wouldn't go to gatherings of, Catholic working clubs in, Michigan or something because, we're not targeting that demographic. So he actually said, we've got to end this identity politics stuff. He was appalled by Trump's election, but he thought that, in a sense, they'd brought it on themselves. And he thought the Democrat Party needed to think seriously about why that came about. For that, this is a classic case. This is a self-identified liberal leftist Democrat Party supporter. He ended up being condemned in a long article in the LA Times written by a colleague of his at Columbia University who bracketed him together with David Duke, the head of the Ku Klux Klan. Anyway, John, any comment on that?
No. I'm finding a lot of what David is saying resonates with me.
Yeah. Okay, David says, Peter is grossly exaggerating the impact of political correctness. Political correctness can go too far, but the idea that it is a significant threat to freedom of speech is just a nonsense. Well, let me relate an anecdote that I experienced on a university a couple of years ago. There was a talk organised at the university by, I don't know if it's the Jewish students group, but at Sydney University, there was a talk which was to be addressed by, the topic was the challenges of counterinsurgency, the moral dilemmas that you face conducting counterinsurgency war, where you have an adversary who's embedded in the civilian population. It was something to that effect was the topic, and the speaker was David Camp, who's a former British military officer who, for a period, commanded British forces in Afghanistan. But that was the topic. And but it was the meeting. It was just a lecture theatre booked, and the talk was to be given. And then after the talk, there was scope for question and answer, so there was plenty of possibility to challenge what he was saying. But about 10 minutes in, the whole thing was invaded by a bunch of Trotskyites screaming through megaphones and shouted him down. In other words, I think that anything like that, or anybody, David Kemp's problem was that he actually supported said of the Israelis during the Gaza conflict in 2014, he said that they did what they could, what they reasonably could to avoid civilian casualties. So you have somebody coming, a group coming in shouting him down, and academics from the university supporting that, and a whole campaign to prevent any attempt to discipline in any way the people who perpetrated that. There are certain issues that you just can't talk about on a university campus without being able to expect violent disruption. Well, when I say violent, they force their way in, which I think is reasonably an act of violence. So I think there is a very serious problem with that. But that, the Queensland University case I was talking about, where there was an orchestrated campaign against a student who wanted to support the Hong Kong demonstrators. In fact, what he was subjected to, and the fact that the university supported it, it seems to me undeniable that there is a major problem. John, any comment on that?
No, I won't.
And filling his administration with who? Didn't think Muslim Brotherhood appeared. Oh, who are you? I'm not sure who you're talking about there, Madeline. I don't think it's Trump. Andrews, both Trumpianism and China's autocracy are a real threat against democracy. Well, I just disagree with that. There's a lot of criticisms you can make of Trump, but there's no comparison between Trump and a state which is imposing all-embracing social control. I mean, it just seems like an absurd analogy. What say you, John?
I'm sympathetic to people who just start getting very worried with Trump because of. It's very hard to see Trump ever relinquishing power.
You reckon?
Look, I would never rule out with Trump. I know this sounds very paranoid, but I wouldn't ever rule out with Trump some coup-like action.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, I don't see any evidence for that. But anyway, let's move on. We've got a huge number of things. Barking Madeline. It's a huge threat to freedom of speech in that people are now self-censoring and going along to get along because of the aggression of the objections to their speech and deplatforming of right-wing speakers. Well, I agree with that. Do you agree, John?
Yes, yep.
Reverend Owen is complaining that he can't see you. There he is. That's John. Can you see him now?
Now explain that my camera's.
Yeah, no, the problem with the camera getting a decent view.
Sorry about that.
Okay, moving along. We're trying to get through this fairly quickly because there's a lot there. Philip Lambert, how do you overturn the money changes in the temple of the ascendant cultural regime? One person said to have attempted that was arrested and crucified. Ironically, the iconoclast is now used cynically. Well, that's a bit deep for me. I don't know quite how to respond to that, or indeed what exactly is being said. What do you think, John?
I'm sorry that I don't quite get the sense of it.
No.
Well, we all know, about Jesus and the money changes in the temple. But I'm just not quite sure what.
I don't quite understand the point. Perhaps Philip could expand on the website next week. Here we go. David Hawkes. Hi, can the presenters give an opinion as to the idea that the Westminster system of government weakens the power of representation of a whole society as against the opinions of minor interests? Westminster, I mean, you're talking about parliamentary democracy more generally, I presume. I don't see how it has that effect. I mean, it gives parliamentary democracy and elections allow people to exercise a judgment over the people that govern them. I can't see the point there. John, anything?
Oh, no, I defer to you, Peter. You're infinitely more experienced with parliamentary democracy than I am.
Well, yeah.
How it operates, and how you respond to lobbying and interests and what have you. I think that's possibly what David's getting at here. That it'll be the well-funded, fanatical, small interests that gets hold of people, representatives in a government, and gets its way, as opposed to what might be in the general interest. I think that's possibly. I apologize if that's not what David means, but maybe you could speak to that because you have the actual.
Well, I'm not quite sure what the alternative would be to a parliamentary democracy, elective parliamentary democracy. I mean, various alternatives have been proposed from time to time, but I'm not aware that any of them have really turned out to be viable. But perhaps David could elaborate. Anyway, let's move on. David Sanderson. The problem with the Ramsay Centre is that it wanted to operate outside normal academic parameters. Control from an outside board was actually a threat to academic freedom as proposed. As far as I know, the question of staffing and curriculum were basically to be determined by the universities, whether perhaps a Ramsay representative on the board of management. I think that was, correct me if I'm wrong, John, but that was the proposal put up to Sydney University, wasn't it?
Look, I think it was an evolution in the Ramsay approach. Actually, they changed their proposal as they went on. I'm pretty sure, and that criticism, as it's articulated here, I doubt if that would have full force against the arrangements that Ramsay has finally made. I'm ready to be corrected, but that's...
Yeah, I think, which universities? The University of Wollongong, I think the University of Queensland, there was one other, wasn't it?
Catholic university.
Catholic, yeah. I don't think in those cases there'd be an external board, an outside board deciding substantive issues about staffing and curriculum. I don't think so. Anyway, the Sydney University one hasn't gone ahead, has it? They ended up rigid.
Yes, that's right.
Negotiations broke down, I think.
Neither ANU or Sydney.
Cherie Wax, as well as Saudi funding of specific Islamic studies program, there are around 10,000 Saudi students studying here pre-COVID, all on government scholarships. Well, that's an interesting piece of information that we can note. Now, Simon last name. It's an interesting name, Simon. You have rightly identified the problem. What is the answer? How do we encourage people to think critically without taking offence? Well, I don't think there's a simple solution to that. I mean, all we can do as individuals is make the case and express concern about the dangers that we face and try to alert people and try to make people a bit less complacent about the rights and freedoms that we have here, which are part of the civilizational heritage that we have, and it's something that should be valued, not deprecated. I mean, we can just try to make that case, I think. John?
Yes, I disagree with you. I agree with you that it just has to become more prominent as a talking point, as an issue, so that we keep an even keel with this.
Yeah. Cherie Wax, most go home post-study, though some females have found Australia with its liberal values to be as attractive as an alternative long-term home. Well, that's a piece of information. Thank you.
Yeah, that rather fits with my more optimistic view than yours, that given time, this will not seem, your fear of Sharia takeover will
I'm not just necessarily saying about a Sharia takeover. I'm saying the more probable scenario is what you see in France, for example, where you end up with a kind of a partial balkanization of the society in the banlieues and so on. In fact, the Home Affairs Minister in Macron's government, I think it was the year before last, resigned his post and said there was just a terrible problem in the banlieues that had effectively defected from France, with the language he used. Rather than a total Sharia takeover. It's that sort of fragmentation of society, I think, is the greater concern. Cherie Wax says, my daughter was one of only 2 or 3 non-Saudi students in the highest of Arabic class at Sydney. Thank you. David Sanderson asks, is Peter going to pay any attention to the chat? Wasn't that what we're doing? We are paying attention, aren't we, John? You'll at least agree with me on that.
Well, I can't actually see the chat line, so it's in your hands. I'm just...
Can't you see the chat? Just click the tab that says comments on your interface should display them. You see that?
How about that?
Got it. All right. Well, that's a relief.
Make a comment before we move on.
Yeah. You want to comment now? Sorry?
It's to do with France. Look, I really am not an authority on that country.
No.
But I've had the sense, and people have said this to me, that France is not a very good country for really kind of getting its head around multiculturalism anyway. It's not very good on, accepting the notion of large communities within the French community. Like, I mean, to be French is to be French, and that's it. I think we in Australia have been actually much better about that. We kind of, don't have that. I mean, apart from extremes like the Hansonite stuff, we don't have that, supreme ego thing about being Australian. We've been tolerant about allowing other communities to exist here. So in France, you've got that, you do have that awful banlieue thing, but that may have a lot to do with how the French have administered the whole thing, as well as, whatever the...
Although you see a similar phenomenon in Britain, for example, where there's a natural tendency, it's partly a natural tendency. People tend to congregate together, but and then you've got Belgium with that Molenbeek suburb, which was sort of incubated some of the main terrorist attacks in recent years. So it's not exclusively confined to France, I don't think. Anyway, David Sanderson. David's getting his 2 bobs worth in. Hope you enjoyed the virtual afternoon tea. The notion that Muslims are humorless fanatics is such an awful caricature. Perhaps Peter should get to know a few Muslims. Well, actually, I've actually known quite a few over the years, particularly in inner city Labor Party branch activism years ago. And I agree. I'm not, I thought I made it clear. I'm not deprecating all Muslims by any means. I've known some very decent and pleasant people who are Muslims. My issue is not with, does not involve saying they're all bad people, not at all. I'm just simply raising the problematical nature of the tenets of their religion, which presents some difficulties for the peaceful coexistence of Muslim and non-Muslim communities in the long term. I think the banlieue phenomenon and things like that, I don't know for sure whether it's just a matter of critical mass of population numbers that sort of starts to naturally happen. But I certainly am not deprecating all Muslims by any means. Peter, Andrews Hex asks, Peter, please open up the comment section under your blurb for this live stream. The problem, Andrews, is with live streaming. You can either, while the live stream is active, you can't add comments in the normal way. That's a YouTube thing. But you will be able to add comments once the live stream has finished. Barking Madeline, like the girls in Rotherham, Telford and Huddersfield have. I think that's directed at, I think that's a reference to those grooming gang scandals, which is a long story in itself, which I don't particularly want to get into here. But do you want to make any remark on that?
No.
I mean, that's a terrible problem that they're having with that business, but that's a large issue in itself. There is in particular a widespread love of cartoons and satire that ridicule Muhammad. Oh, yeah. I think that is a satirical comment, isn't it? I think so, unless I'm misinterpreting it. Andrews, John, India and other developing democracies, this is directed to you, John. India and other developing democracies also brought out millions of people of property without China's autocratic regime tyrannizing the population. I think that,
that's a fair point. That is a very fair point. I think China's somewhat ahead of India in doing that, but it's a very fair point. And
yeah.
Play cricket too. I mean,
I think the point I'd make about that, I mean, it is true that over the last 30 years, since the opening up under Deng Xiaoping and the economic liberalisation, there has been a huge improvement in living standards for a substantial part of the population. I believe that, so you've now got a middle class in China of 300 to 400 million people. I think at the same time, there's a large part of the population that have been left behind. But the more general point I'd make is look at Taiwan. Everything good that the Chinese regime has accomplished has been done better and earlier in Taiwan under which is now under democratic governance. Part of what we hear from apologists for the regime is, that the Communist Party dictatorship was in somehow a necessary condition of that economic improvement. Well, that's obviously not the case, because you look at a range of East Asian cultures which have certain cultural virtues that make, the focus on education, the strong work ethic and so forth, that really, you really have to suppress those sort of countries to prevent that rapid growth in living standards. You certainly don't need autocratic governance in order to achieve that. Not the sort of autocratic governance they have in China, anyway. Simon, unless you want to add something, John?
No, not on this point, no.
Simon, last name. Mighty Peter, Islam or Islamists? So he's asking me, there's this kind of I mean, I'm not against the use of the term Islamist, because I think it's important to give people in Islamic communities some sort of room to distance themselves from the hardliners without, being, without actually abandoning Islam itself. I've said a number of times, and I won't repeat myself, that Islam is to an extent inherently political. So, some people say Islamism is political Islam. In other words, Islam with a political project. But I think if you look at the Quran, the Hadith, and the Sirah, the basic texts of Islam, there's an obligation to assert oneself in society to achieve certain Islamic goals for those who take the tenets of the creed to heart and try to give effect to them, which kind of blurs the distinction between Islam and Islamism. However, I think that moderates in those communities need to be given space to detach themselves from the extremists, and one way to do that is to make that distinction. So it's fine by me. Cherie Wax then sort of confirmed what I sort of just said. He already talked about political Islam as being the problem. Andrews, just as Islamic theocracy, the CCP does not separate. Not sure what you're getting at there, Andrews. Anyway, moving on. David Sanderson. David is the chief critic today, which is good. These readings by Peter of the Bible and the Quran are frankly ridiculous. It would be perfectly easy to choose passages from the Bible that are incompatible with liberal democracy. True, but it does not impose an obligation on its adherents to assert themselves and establish supremacy in the society in which they live, in the way that verse 929 in the Quran, for example, does. Quranic verses have a status in Islam that, say, Old Testament verses don't have in Christianity. All the nasty stuff in the Old Testament, all the violent bits, are predominantly descriptive rather than prescriptive. whereas some of the more worrying tenets in Islam are in fact, either based in the Quran or based in the Hadith, authoritative accounts of the life of Muhammad, which are, for Muslims, if they're deemed Hadiths are deemed if they're deemed authentic, then they are normative Islam. So I think there is a distinction.
Can I say something here?
Yeah.
There is one very big difference. You can pick, bits of the Bible, as unpalatable as bits of the Quran. But
particularly the Old Testament, I agree.
But no, this is the important difference. There's a whole massive investment and infrastructure and excellence of scholarship within Western universities, and especially in the United States, of this thoroughgoing textual criticism, so that no Bible text is immune from being demythologized, being, put in its historical circumstances to be understood, or to be refuted, or to be seen as impossible. There's a whole critical apparatus that works, and within those same Western universities that have taken a bit of a drubbing today, so that this has got to be a very big difference. I can't imagine this kind of scholarly intellectual work going on in Islamic countries about the Quran and about all Muslim documents. I just can't imagine it.
Have you heard of Tom Holland? He's a British historian who, a few years back, wrote a book called In the Shadow of the Sword, which presents an account of Islamic origins, which, he sort of argues that the Quran didn't really come together as a coherent whole until around about the 8th or 9th century, well after the events that were, described, the traditional, Islamic understanding of its origins. But and there was actually he actually made a documentary film about it by Channel 4 in the UK. And when he put this out, when the film came out, the book didn't get much of a reaction, but when the film came out, he said that by the time the film had ended, his Twitter feed was absolutely inundated with death threats. This is a point. I mean, Christianity, since the early 19th century, I think, has been subjected to this kind of critical scholarship. So people can go and, dispute the historicity of Jesus or whatever. And then, the churches will try to answer that. But I just don't think you can do that with Islam, even in Western countries.
Yes, I think you're right. I hold it is a difference. There's also a bit of a disconnect, interestingly, between the level of Christian textual criticism available, and that, in a way, apparently most of the, from what I've heard, most of the ministers and priests who study, these days are exposed to, but they don't let the faithful know a lot about this. So, you'll see Christian spokesmen at Easter or Christmas quoting bits of the Bible, that anybody who's done any sort of reading in that area knows is fictional.
Right.
But anyway, that's just a point in passing.
Sorry, what do we got? Both fundamental Islam religiously and the CCP ideologically repudiate universal human rights, and especially the core notion of freedom of speech and conscience. Agreed. So I agree with that. Do you agree, John?
I'm sure I do.
Good. We've got some measure of agreement. Robert Tobias, it is absurd and dangerous, I believe, to see identity politics as a kind of intellectual immune disorder preventing Western civilization from seeing clearly the threat it faces. Peter, haven't you set yourself in opposition to an extreme form of identity politics? Well, I've set myself in opposition to the kind of identity politics that, to give an example I cited earlier, of Sarah Haider, a young Pakistani-American woman who defected from Islam, is condemned by her erstwhile colleagues on the left for her decision, even though she remained loyal to the left liberal cause more generally. That's the sort of identity politics, the idea that you're born into a milieu that defines you. You know, you're defined by a set of intersecting categories. You're either a member of an oppressor identity or an oppressed identity. That's the kind of identity politics I'm against. I mean, some sort of loose identification with some culture, I don't see as particularly problematical. John?
No, I haven't got anything particular to add to that, Peter.
Okay. Now, we're getting on in time. We're not going to get through all this. There's lots of stuff. Why don't we give it another 5 minutes and then call it a day, eh?
Sure. Well, it's
we're trying to. What I hope to be able to do is to. It might be possible to import this whole chat stream onto our website, so people will be able to continue the discussion and, in fact, elaborate on the points that they've made within the obviously limited confines of the chat window. I'd really like to see this conversation continue. But I suggest we wind up in about 5 minutes. So do a few more. Tony Morrow, I'm with Ferguson. Western democracies removed religion from governing bodies about 5 or more centuries ago. The fundamentalist Christians not running the countries in which they reside. Well, I think that's broadly right. There's an interesting take on in America with the evangelicals and their support of Trump. There was some journalist actually went out into Trump land to try and understand this, and the conclusion he reached was that with the Christian evangelicals, they sort of understood that Trump really wasn't one of them. He with his lifestyle and behaviour, he's hardly that of an evangelical Christian. But they supported him because they thought at some point he'd protect their religious liberties, and but I don't think they are running the country. And in a real sense, they are able to exert some influence, obviously, because they're a large electoral bloc. But anyway, that's all I'll say about that. Well, look, why don't we wind it up here? And I thank everybody who's contributed, and John especially. And we'll try and continue the discussion next week. Anything to say, John?
No, I appreciate all the comments people have been making. I understand, the range here, and there are some. I can see some more comments coming up that would have been good to talk about. Robert Tobias's the question of economic and political power, which favors some groups in society over others. I think that's really important, you know, to not forget about when we're talking about what's going on here. But that's all I'll say. Thank you very much.
No, well, as a general proposition, I'd agree. All right, well, on that happy note of concord, why don't we call it a day? And don't forget, next Saturday, we've got Clive Hamilton. He'll be talking, he knows vastly more about China and its role in Australia than I do. And that should be a very interesting session. So 4 o'clock next Saturday. And thank you all. Thank you for your contributions, whether you agreed or fundamentally disagreed with what I or John have said. I think we've had a good exchange, and I hope we can continue it. Thank you very much. So we'll end the broadcast at this point.